Okay, so continuing on the theme and moving into areas that I've been thinking about, researching in for the past decade or so, I want to start focusing in on notions of choice, mobility, linking this to ideas of modernity as we've been doing in the last several months. And I want to do this through the lens of education. And I want us to reflect upon the kind of choices that we make as individuals and those around us are making as well. And to start asking ourselves questions about, is this what we really want? Is this really what we're chasing in our lives? And to be able to pose those questions of ourselves, I think is important and helpful. And help us think about the ways in which we're shaping a world that is shaping us. And I'd like to think that this can become part of what you're going to reflect upon, no matter what the sphere of interest is in your final work for this particular unit of study. I want to open with 3 quotes, 2 of which came from fieldwork, from interviews that I'd done. The first 2 come from young people. Shannon, student of 15 years old, commenting on private schools. You know, when you're a little girl, you just want to wear one of those cool-looking private school uniforms, and you just want to, you go to a private school, something about it which is just so, oh, it's a private school. The Harry Potter factor is something I think sort of play there. I knew that I wanted to go places, said Samuel, where I could get a good education, and so private school, it's automatically what everyone thinks, when it comes to good education. These were 2 interviews that I conducted with these people, Shannon and Samuel, pseudonyms, not their real names, about school choice and the choices that they'd been involved with as students. The fact that both of them ended up in a government school gives us some pause for thought. That's where they finished their high school education. And then there's a scholar, Nicholas Rose, key scholar, political scientist, making the point about how liberalism depends upon a novel specification of the subjects of rule as active in their own government. Now here's a challenge for you. How do those ideas, expressed by Shannon and Samuel, suggest ways in which people are subjects of rule and active in their own government through the choices they make? I want to think about the contemporary scenes through the lens of neoliberalism and second or late modernity, through Beck, Bonds and Lau in particular, who you've already read. Neoliberalism is about reducing the size of the state. Degovernmentalization is how Nicholas Rose describes this. Creating markets governed by the rationalities of competition, accountability, consumer demand, and governing not through society but through the regulated choices of individual citizens and clients. Regulated choices is significant here. Governments are intent on putting in place policies that make us our own entrepreneurs, our own self-projects, to put it in a Beck, Bonds and Lau's kind of way. What neoliberalism emphasises is the private over the public, competition versus, well, what should we call this? Cooperation? Collusion, perhaps, is the pejorative that tends to get thrown at this. Decentralisation versus bureaucratic centres. Markets versus service. The best service will come through the market is the logic here. Free markets versus regulation and tariffs. Australia as being one of the paragons of virtue in that regard, taking down the tariff wall as much as they can. Where citizens become clients, where choice is emphasised over homogeneity or equity, as happens really in schools especially, and self-help is valorised much more than welfare. But of course it is. It's part of a kind of common sense, not just of our time perhaps, but of industrial society. Maybe it's been a part. So there's a liberal strand of thinking that's been so much a part of what's gone on. What Rose suggests is new about all of this is the fact that government is taking a part, is playing a role in regulating these choices, in regulating the uptake of the market. That's what he's suggesting is different in this late modernity. Just to remind you of some of the ideas from Beck, Bonds and Lau in this regard about globalisation being part of what we're talking about, the loss of certainty regarding the role of the nation state in our lives. Will it won't look after us in the same way perhaps as it did in the past. Intensification of individualisation, the self project that I've already discussed and we've been discussing over the past several weeks. Flexibilisation of work, the loss of the full employment society that the writers talk about there. Shifting of gender roles, dissolving of the sexual division of labour. I'm wondering about that. I was reading an article this morning that I may throw into the mix next week, in the next module, about women doing non-traditional labour in the UK. I'm not sure that sexual division of labour has disappeared, and we'll focus next week in on families and ask questions about sexual division of labour in that regard. Has gender become less and less relevant? It's an interesting question to pose of all of us. Increasing awareness of nature as part of society is another part of what they're arguing. School boundaries, as unnatural as they come perhaps. Let's just talk about a couple of things here because I think it helps capture some of the shifts that I've just described. Post-Second World War Australia, students enrolling in government schools were obliged to attend their local school. There was a catchment area, there were carefully laid out maps. You will all go here, and it was all part of guaranteeing a equitable education, an education that was available to all and that was somehow non-discriminatory. So you can't just go to whatever school you want to go to. We are building resources around your local area, and we are going to build a comprehensive education around each and every catchment area. It was a grand modernising thing. Post-1990s in Australia, we start to get, or the 1990s and into our current time, a dissolving of these boundaries. Parents and students able to choose the schools they wanted to go to became part of the enduring rhetoric and in the end the practice. It took a long time to get there, which I've documented in some of the work that I've done here. Dissolving boundaries, except for a place like Rossmoor Senior High School, declaring itself on its website to be one of the nation's leading schools. Academic excellence, outstanding visual and performing arts and sports programs, exciting opportunities in vocational education, and a strong and vibrant pastoral care focus, creating a learning environment in which students excel. Rossmoor Senior High, Australian newspaper's inaugural School of the Year in 2001, hence its claim, and a valid claim, of being one of the nation's leading schools. On the website, if you look hard enough, and it's not that hard to find it, you'll see this statement. Rossmoor Senior High School is a local intake school that offers a gifted and talented languages program and specialist classical music, mathematics and volleyball programs. Now let's just have a look at that. It's a local intake school. That means you can only go in there if you are within the specified boundaries, and they've got the maps available should you wish to see it. But on top of this, they offer gifted and talented languages programs, specialist classical music, mathematics and volleyball programs. What sort of students do you think they're trying to attract through those programs? They're certainly not offering it to gifted boilermakers, that's for sure. The school provides places for students whose families are residing within the boundaries of Rossmoor Senior High School local intake area at the time that the enrolment commences. The boundaries are as determined by the Department of Education of Western Australia. Proof of residency within the local intake area is required. You must show that you're a ratepayer in some way, or perhaps that you're renting in the area. Real estate agents will point out that to be within that catchment area adds $20,000 to the cost of the mortgage, cost of the sale of the house, which is fascinating to contemplate. It's probably a very rational decision in lots of ways. It is a leading school and people are clambering to get in there, and we can see in this a selection by mortgage in the way in which that works. I interviewed a teacher and a parent at the school in which he was working. I called it Juniper High, another pseudonym. And this Juniper High was known as one of the better schools of Western Australia. And when I was asking this person about schools as he understood it, he made this following comment. What you're creating is little enclaves of like-minded wealthy people and enclaves of people who are all of the same type. And I think if we're not careful, it's going to happen with our government schools. Those who have no choice have just got to accept what's there, and those who've got double incomes and highly motivated, and I mean, years ago most of these people would have been happy with a government school, to be quite honest. I think schools like this, his own school, probably reflects what people were getting 20, 30 years ago to a certain extent everywhere. So that's through this. through the system that was in place at that particular time, comprehensive schooling. What a lot of people are paying for is what they got for free 30 years ago. Does that make sense? Well, let me ask you that. Does that make sense to you? Go and ask your parents, perhaps, about the changes that they've noticed. Notions of mobile modernity that I'm trying to get at. There is much matter in motion these days. Capital, labour, families. Always has been, but I think we could argue that perhaps this is intensified in the recent past, in this so-called globalising era. And what we see is further disembedding of social relations from places and locales. And there is in all of this a promise of opportunity, of freedom, of progress, and education is a key promulgator of this kind of idea, of these kinds of ideas. As Michael Corbett writes in his book about rural towns and remote towns in Canada, his book's called Learning to Leave, a play on Willis's text, Learning to Labour. Learning to leave. Schools are telling students, if you want to make something of yourself, get the hell out of this place, get the hell out of this small town and go and become part of the metropolitan elite, or become part of the metropolitan cosmopolitan world by which opportunity, freedom and progress will come to you. There are such strong class dimensions to this. Middle classes, I think, are really schooled in believing that if you want to progress, you have to keep moving. Don't stay in the one place. Education and mobile modernity. Well, education gets linked very strongly with social mobility, and clearly that's been the case for many years, probably more so now, and a greater awareness of it now, as I think was picked up in the parent and teacher's comment from earlier. Physical mobility is also part of this. The location of schools and universities make a big impact on family decision making. Big impact. And perhaps you could think about that through your own biographies, about where you've lived and the ways in which these choices have been shaped, and ask yourself to what degree has education played a role in that. So thinking about the sociology of choice, I'm thinking about this in terms of the impetus of a second late modernity, a neoliberal modernity, where there's no choice but to choose. There is increasing significance on further education. There is a valorisation of the private over the public, and where there are changing generational relations that I think are also part of this, and perhaps that's something you want to contemplate as we go. It's a practice approach that I'm advocating. Cultured, structured agents, social class positioning, the significance of this, people with a higher education family tradition, what difference that makes to the kind of choices that they make. So people who come from families that have been involved with university education before, compared with families who haven't, and what difference that makes to the kinds of choices that people make. There's also the significance of place, the metropole, the rural, the regional, the remote, sorts of things that I've talked about already. And out of this come choice stories. I know if I talk to parents now in these days and ask them about their school choice story, I am going to get a very rich discussion for the most part, particularly if I talk to women, because it is women who do the work of choice in families. There are statistical stories to tell, and there are the deeply personal stories to tell. So let me go back to the same parent and teacher who I interviewed at his school, and I was talking to him on one of the tables outside at which the students ate their lunch and shared their stories. And with the recording device on, he told me that 30, 40 years ago, parents didn't even take that active an interest in what their kids did once they went out the door. They gave them their lunch and they went to school. And I presume he's talking from his own experience here, but there's something generalisable out of it probably. I mean, not even the mums are all that much involved, really. How's that shifted? I think because everything's become so more competitive, and the stakes, I think we're a more materialistic minded society. You've got to have, double professional income to get ahead, and the whole thrust of everything has changed. The ways in which our decision making is being affected by cultural change, part of what this gentleman's contemplating, I'm inviting you to keep contemplating these things as well. So let's have a look at some of the patterns that are being picked up in these kinds of ideas from the teacher parent I've just talked about, and plenty of other people I've spoken with about this topic. Just have a look. This has come from the ABS report on schools 2010. Government school enrolments in that decade from 2000 to 2010 falling quite significantly, particularly at the secondary level. Just bear in mind though the scale that's being used here. It does amplify the curve, it does amplify the fall. In ways it's not amplified in the same way here. So Catholic school enrolment stayed fairly steady actually in and around the 20% mark. And of course what's being indicated here that it's in secondary schools that they have the greater enrolments, and in government schools, primary schools, and primary schools is where government schools have the greatest enrolment. And then when you go to independent schools, look at the gap between the secondary and the primary. I've heard parents say many times the secondary school doesn't matter much. It's the primary school doesn't matter much, so my apologies there. It's the secondary schools where things really matter, the pointy end of school, where of course decisions about getting into university are made. So the places where students are moving towards university. And parents being interviewed about what they want their students to do in Australia, overwhelmingly they want them to go to university. They are far less interested in their kids getting apprenticeships. So it's very clear about the kind of decision making that's there, and probably part of the impetus of what we're seeing here. I've been doing research in a place called Karratha. I'll tell you a little bit about that town in a moment. It's in the far north of Western Australia. And one of the things I did recently was look at the results of the 2011 census and what came out of that. And I got interested in what was happening to the age groups and the proportions of persons under particular age in a particular year, so under the age of 20. And what I did then, excuse me, I'm not going to pause for that. Okay, what I started to look at and started to tease out of these figures was, well, what proportion of persons under the age of 20 are in each of the age groups and are living in Karratha? So here's the Karratha figure here, and you can see the proportions falling from around a high of 7%, around about the age of 8, 9, 10. They reach the average of the state for the distribution in that under 20 age group. And then start to fall in Karratha once we get to the age of 11 and 12, and going from there. And then when you look at the state and Perth, the capital city, we start to see something happening here that intrigued me, which caused me to look at these figures. So I used 4-year increments, 4-year age groupings, and just did some mucking around the figures to see about this. 77.4% of the population live in Perth. And I then looked at proportion of people living in Perth in particular age groups, so 0 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 12, and so on. The rise occurring here and starting to fall again down and getting below the average in around the 30s, and then it looks like people return to Perth to die. But here, I think there's an education story going on. I think people are coming to the city for educational opportunities, and it looks to be starting between 12 and 16 and really reaches its peak getting up to the age of 20. Now, I can't prove it to you. I'm guessing that it's got something to do with education. This state is a third of the Australian continent, 2.5 million square kilometres, and yet it's overwhelmingly central. So Perth is overwhelmingly central to this state, and as I pointed out already, more than 3/4 of the population live in Perth. At the last census, 77.4%. Karratha, 1,535 kilometres north of Perth. It's an oil and gas and an iron ore town, delivering this produce to Southeast and Eastern Asia mainly. Epicentre of global capitalism in the last decade, no question about that. Enormous amounts of money and wealth have been generated and moving through this particular town. It's its epicentre, therefore, of mobile modernity. It has had a great deal of movement, and we can see this in what's described as population churn by the demographers. 2006 census, I don't have the 2011 figures yet. You can see there, compared with the state, an enormous turnover of people in a town of Karratha. Only 24% of those who were living there 5 years prior were still living in Karratha. The Northwest Shelf joint venture estimates that this sort of churn in employees in this case was costing them $15 million per annum. Now, the Northwest Shelf joint venture is the group that is extracting and exporting the oil and the gas from that particular region. And they identified in their research on this the transition to high school as a key decision-making point for families in the area. So they became concerned about the links between these and the economics of getting the gas and the oil out and about. And quality of education was identified. Teacher quality, which was related to teacher churn. Teachers don't hang around these towns for very long, and for many different reasons. And student academic performance was certainly part of this as well. Learning to Leave was Michael Corbett's book. I'm starting to write about the learning to stay that gets encouraged, the ways in which we're trying to move against mobility, at least temporarily, in the industry up in Karratha. Put in place was the Karratha Education Initiative, sponsored by the Northwest Shelf Joint Venture. So we're looking here at a private partnership with local schools. 2 schools, one of them a government school, one of them the local Catholic school. Of course, both funded by the government ultimately. They injected $3 million into these schools over the 3 years that I was doing this study. And what this included was after-school tutoring and online tutoring, TE revision classes, so revision classes for the tertiary entrance examination, university entrance, leadership training, international tours. Technology infrastructure was also put in place. In these schools you see smart boards and wireless internet put in place. There are many things I could talk about here. There was a very early commitment to a holistic education, but very quickly the focus went to the pointy end, to the year 12 and exit results. So the university entrance results became very much part of what they were looking at. Scholarships put in place to support students going to university, but that's where the focus went to. And at St. Luke's at Leach, the Catholic school, the benchmark was equivalence with the high quality schools in Perth. Part of what I'm thinking about here and thinking with is this particular chart. 2 different ways of thinking about class in terms of income and high formal education. So here is very much the materialist dimension, and here is more of the status dimension. Marx, Weber, maybe one way of thinking about this. And the natural order of things in a modernizing society is the higher the education, the greater the income. Of course, which one's the independent and which one's the dependent variable here is an interesting question to pose. Maybe I should have them inverted, but sometimes, of course, it's hard not to think about it in this way. The higher the income, the more chance you're going to have of having a high formal education. But this arrow tells its own little moral story. The greater your qualifications, the greater your chances of earning better money, of having better jobs. And work hard, and that becomes part of the story, doesn't it? That you get told from home and at schools, work hard and you'll become part of the deserving wealthy. In a place like Karratha, you've got a whole group of people that I call blue-collar affluent, who don't have high formal education, but certainly have high incomes, especially compared with people living in Perth or in regional centres elsewhere. And for people with high formal education who may actually be over here, looking at this group here, they do start to look like part of an undeserving rich. They have not worked in the same way to achieve what they have, the kind of affluence that they have. And I think that creates some very interesting questions. Schools, however, I would argue, tend to still focus themselves in and around the values of this grouping here. I do agree with Bourdieu that that does tend to be the case, and I think that the focus in on tertiary entrance examinations is part of that particular trend. This gives you just some idea of the kind of work I did up there, the interviews I conducted amongst parents, especially parents asking about the family decision making that was going on. It was mainly women that I spoke with. When you do school choice work, that's what tends to happen. And then just some sense of the here in Table 4 about the different distributions of students in the schools that they're in. Look, I don't want to go into all of those details there. What I'm trying to get at is that I gained out of this a whole richness of stories, diversity of stories, with some patterns and with some divergence as well. Choice stories, and that I can split into those who are leaving or have left, and the stayers. And as you can see in here, I did interview some people who'd been in Karratha and are now in Perth to ask them about the decisions that went into that move. So the leavers and the stayers. A practice approach, as I've already suggested, cultured, structured agency. Social class positioning is something that I'm interested in. Those coming from a higher education family tradition, their trust in local education tended to be low. They were concerned about it, and even those who stayed expressed that concern, but they were, in the end, they wanted to keep their family together. Their income was good in Karratha, and for some of them that was the work that they knew and knew best, and they were not interested in flying in and flying out, being located elsewhere. They wanted to keep the family together. That was a significant part of it. The significance of place. Karratha, with its booming and busting economy, its remoteness and the effects that has on decisions for teachers to stay. 3/4 of the population live in Perth. Where do people want to be? They want to be where their family and where their friends are. And so you've got these kind of pulls always away from these remote towns. The impetus of a second and late modernity, neoliberal modernity, no choice but to choose. You have to keep making active decisions about what's going to happen, and if you don't make the right decisions for your child, it's your fault. It's no longer the state's responsibility to make sure that everybody gets the same education. Think about what Prime Minister Gillard had to say about second class goes for people in Australia. Increasing significance of further education in this story, particularly in a world where work is no longer guaranteed for people. So further education seems to be one of the paths to that. And then of course the significance of family that is so beautifully emphasised by Cuervo and Wynne in their particular book. That's certainly worth contemplating. And the changing kind of dynamics of family relationships. Maybe in the 50s and 60s generations were in a lot more tension than they are now. And it's a kind of curious thing when I think about mobilities in this regard. Whereas in the high modernity people were being encouraged to move away from their family, there seems to be less encouragement these days, which may be related to housing affordability, but it may also be about shifts in family structures, themes that we might pick up on next week. Let's see how we go. How do we become neoliberal subjects? Well, Nicholas Rose suggests that liberalism depends upon governments being able to convince the subjects of rule to become active in their own governance. We've got the self project of second modernity to think about the job insecurity that I've already highlighted, the significance of higher and further education in regards to this, and the kind of decision making that families have to go through in order to ensure their children's future, either that they don't fall from the status that has already been achieved, or that they can get further up the ladder. How do we become neoliberal subjects? There's a question for you. Well, let me suggest to you that it happens by the choices that we make, and that we make all the time. I've talked about the cultured, structured agency that is part of our every living moment. And when Prime Minister Gillard makes this declaration that you show what you value through the choices you make, I think it's worth pausing and asking ourselves of ourselves, and of course of those around us, to what extent are we making the choices we make? Are we making the choices we want to make? To what extent are we being steered and guided by forces beyond us to make decisions that maybe if we stopped and thought for a little bit longer, the kinds of agency that we use, the kind of agency that we employ, may be just a little bit different. But let's keep that in mind. We show what we value through the choices we make. Good luck with all the different choices you're making into the near future.